Well, thanks very much, Kurt, for your remarks. I think we'll move on now to the first panel, just to keep us on track. So let me go ahead and invite George Nield to unmute himself and to introduce members of the panel.
Very good. Thank you, Jim. I really appreciate all of your efforts in organizing this event. I'd also like to thank Joe Batia and the American National Standards Institute for enabling today's discussion about what has become a very important issue within the space community. Let me start out with a little context, if I could. In response to some high-profile collisions, increasing congestion in low Earth orbit, and growing concerns about the risks of orbital debris, there's been a lot of talk in recent years about the need for a civil space traffic management system that would work to enhance the safety of space operations and preserve the space environment. Space Policy Directive 3 was clearly an important first step in achieving that goal. However, here we are almost 2.5 years later, and Congress has not yet come to an agreement on the recommendations included in that directive. In my opinion, the current system of space situational awareness, in which the DoD maintains a catalog of resident space objects and sends out notices of potential conjunctions, no longer meets the needs of the user community. I believe that we have reached a point where it is urgent that the U.S. government make some decisions on both roles and responsibilities and on implementation options for how we should proceed. Should those decisions continue to be deferred, the U.S. will likely lose its opportunity to influence how the rest of the world deals with the safety of space operations. Our first panel today has representatives from the key stakeholder agencies within the federal government, all of whom have been actively involved in working these issues. Kevin O'Connell, the Director of the Office of Space Commerce from the U.S. Department of Commerce, Karl Kensinger, Acting Division Chief of the International Bureau Satellite Division at the Federal Communications Commission. Steph Earle is the Acting Deputy Division Chief, Policy and Innovation Division, Office of Commercial Space Transportation at the FAA. Dr. J.C. Liou is the Chief Scientist for Orbital Debris at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. And Jeff Braxton is the Chief Analyst for Intradepartmental and Interagency Engagement at U.S. Space Command. Why don't we start with some brief opening comments by each of our panelists, and then we'll transition into some Q&A. Kevin, could you start us off, please?
Sure. Good morning, George, and thanks very much for the introduction. Also appreciate Scraps Hernandez's introduction as well to the broad topic. Finally, I'd like to thank Joe and Jim for setting up this session on the importance of standards in the commercial space industry. So we're already off to a very good start. The space industry is actually growing and diversifying very, very quickly, and that's key to its success. But leadership in the area of technical standards and industry consensus will create a needed positive impact in areas like improving space safety and coordination, as we're discussing, including the broad usability of space data, just to name a couple. But it's also very interesting from an international competition standpoint. The United States has the largest and most advanced commercial space industry, but without careful attention to international developments in this area, we would quickly lose our competitive edge. And again, George has highlighted the decades-long American leadership in this area, and what we're all really trying to do is to make sure we sustain and advance that leadership. Just last week, the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission submitted its annual report to the Congress, where it encouraged the government to take a larger role in international standards development. Traditionally, U.S. companies have led the standards development arena, but the U.S.-China ESRC recommended establishing a government committee to work with industry and support U.S. standards goal in this area. Now, the recommendation comes as a result of Chinese efforts to influence the standards development process, but we want to make sure, everybody here wants to make sure that the U.S. is maintaining a strong voice in standards development, and it's something that we're focused on in the Office of Space Commerce. Part of the government's role in encouraging the development of the commercial space industry is to support that industry both at home and abroad and across a spectrum of competitive issues. This is one of the many areas that government can advocate on behalf of industry. And again, Joe, I think you highlighted it, the importance of public-private partnerships in this area, absolutely key. Now, whether the government establishes an official committee focused on standard development, we need to make sure that we're mobilizing all relevant agencies, including everyone on this call, to take an active part in promoting standards priorities. And this is especially important in the area on space safety and sustainability, which is essential to the growth of space commerce and obviously our goals in space exploration. Last week, a U.S. proposal for a new work item in the International Organization for Standardization on, quote, space traffic coordination and management failed to garner the two-thirds majority required for approval. While this was disappointing, the U.S. government fully supports this initiative. After the start of the new year, Commerce and other federal agencies and departments will participate in the U.S. Technical Advisory Group efforts to develop a new ISO proposal focused on technical standards for space traffic coordination. Commerce will also work with the Department of State to build international support for the new proposal, which advances key U.S. space policy principles and goals. One of the first steps here is promoting a common understanding of space flight safety within the international community and continuing our international and domestic work to promote the long-term safety and sustainability of the space environment. Now, we've been involved in a number of areas here. Other than the discussions we've participated here with ANSI, we're involved with the AIAA working group that's drawing on U.S. and international participants to create a lexicon for SSA and associated spaceflight safety functions. The idea here is to establish a common understanding of existing terms, their relationships, and their contexts. We're also participating in AST's technical committee known as F47, focused on commercial spaceflight. In our efforts at the Department of Commerce, folks often think about the parallel efforts we're working on with the Open Architecture Data Repository, which of course is a cloud-based system of data and analysis tools for space operators to accelerate fast-paced technological developments into operational applications for working together safely and sustainably in space. Speed is of the essence here, really is, because of the nature of the problem, because of how space is growing and diversifying from an economic perspective, among others. And so we really have to make progress, to George's initial point. You know, as just an example, the Department of Commerce holds by far the largest volume in civil space data assets. The terrestrial, ocean, and space weather data sets are over 38 petabytes that have been built, and they're used across the department and with our collaborators like NASA. OSC will continue to draw upon the deep expertise from the department, as well as in other areas like data fusion and management, and data sharing for a community-built, globally accessible OADR. Recently, we hosted an industry day. Some of you have participated in this, supporting the development of the OADR by soliciting information on commercial solutions to improve data management, fusion and visualization, analysis, and other elements. And part of the standards development process is formalizing industry best practices. And unexpected surprise was that the industry days actually helped surface some existing and other developing best practices that support space safety and coordination. It's no secret here that the commercial space industry is well ahead of the government on establishing industry-wide best standards and practices. All other considerations aside, it's just smart business. As everyone on the call knows, space is so critical to so many areas of our lives and increasingly important to the creation of a high-tech workforce and economic growth. We're seeing the space economy diversify in so many different ways, and standards will be the keys to speed and depth of that growth. And with that, I'll look forward to the rest of the discussion today and our continuing work on standards development. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Kevin. That was great. Why don't we move then to the FCC? Karl, can you give us some opening comments, please?
Sure. Good morning, and thank you for having me. I'll focus on the FCC's activities concerning its orbital debris rules. Next slide, please. So we have at the FCC rules that were adopted in 2004 that require companies seeking licenses from the FCC to submit an orbital debris mitigation plan. It has to address collision risk, measures to avoid accidental explosions, end-of-life disposal of the spacecraft, and that includes something that I'm sure will come up more in the discussion, the so-called 25-year requirement, which is the requirement to remove satellites in low Earth orbit within 25 years after their end of mission. The approach, and this has been applied since adoption of those rules, is if a plan is inadequate, the FCC can require a modification prior to licensing or impose conditions or conceivably deny the license. The debris mitigation rules apply, the FCC rules apply to non-federal satellites, and they include CubeSats and other small satellites. The FCC rules from 2004 closely tracked the U.S. government orbital debris mitigation standard practices, although there were some areas in which the FCC rules were adapted to suit the licensing process. In 2020, the FCC adopted updates to incorporate new assessment methods and criteria for its rules, to codify some of the existing licensing practices that had developed since 2004 based on experience in individual cases. There was also, I think, one of the goals of this particular update was to examine the suitability of some of the current criteria for large constellations, and in particular with a focus on some of the debris mitigation criteria that are stated in terms of individual satellites. The FCC's update was issued in April of this year, and there were two components to that. One was a report and order that adopted changes to the rules, and the other component was a further notice of proposed rulemaking that sought additional comment on some aspects of the FCC rule update. Next slide, please. So the revisions that were made coincide with revisions to the U.S. government orbital debris mitigation standard practices. I'm sure J.C. Liou, who ably led that revision effort, will address that in his comments coming up. What the FCC changes did was to adopt numerical values for several existing requirements. That includes the collision risk per satellite and the casualty risk assessment, and the values which you see in the slide there do track those specified in the orbital debris mitigation standard practices, and grow out of, I think, also the NASA standards and the assessment tools that NASA has developed and that are now increasingly widely used in by commercial operators in completing debris assessment for their systems. Next slide, please. In addition, the Commission adopted a couple of additional updates. There is a requirement that applicants certify that upon receipt of a space situational awareness conjunction warning, the operator will review and take all possible steps to assess the collision risk and mitigate that risk if necessary. There is a requirement that applicants must include statements related to protecting inhabitable spacecraft, primarily obviously a Liou concern, low Earth orbit concern, statements related to maneuverability, trackability, and identification of the satellites, and information about the operator's efforts to share data for space situational awareness. There are also other disclosures that are adapted for specific subsets of satellite operations, including use of deployment devices, the release of liquids that made persistent space and proximity operations, one spacecraft approaching another closely. So the proceeding, the current status is that 2 of the rule updates became effective September 24th. Those had to do with a clarification on the control of transmitting stations and a provision concerning coordination of orbit-raising maneuvers for geostationary satellites. Other updates are subject to Paperwork Reduction Act requirements, and those requirements, the efforts to address those are underway, and so those provisions will become effective at a later date. There were petitions for reconsideration filed earlier this year, and there's a formal pleading cycle for those that recently closed. Next slide, please. So the further notice invited additional comment on a number of issues, largely related, in many respects, related to large constellations. There is a proposal to adopt the metric from the Orbital Debris Mitigation Standard Practices with respect to accidental explosions. There's also a set of questions about approaches to addressing collision risk and casualty risk for satellite constellations on a system-wide basis. Again, these are criteria that are specified as per satellite criteria, and the questions here go to whether there should be a different or more stringent standard or a more comprehensive standard developed for large constellations involving multiple satellites. There was a question about requiring maneuverability for spacecraft and space stations located above a certain altitude in low Earth orbit, and other possible limits on post-mission orbital lifetime. Many of these are related to a question of whether the so-called 25-year requirement is overly permissive and permits satellites to stay on orbit for a much longer time than is desirable. And then finally, the Commission requested comment on adoption of a number of several requirements that go more to legal and economic issues. One, a possible indemnification requirement that requires license recipients to indemnify the U.S. government for any claims that would arise under the international treaty regime, which does involve government liability. And the other, the use of a surety bond that is tied to successful post-mission disposal of the spacecraft. There were approximately 40 comments. I think actually the number maybe is a little higher than that, filed before the October 9, 2020 deadline. And the reply comments for that process were submitted on November 9, with I think a few less than the original 40, but certainly wide and active participation in the proceeding. So with that, I'll pause and move on to the next presentation.
Thank you, Karl. Why don't we transition then to the FAA and see if Steph Earle has some opening comments for us. Steph?
All right, thanks, George. And thank you for inviting me on this panel. So the FAA has been involved in standards. It's actually one of the things that's in our law. So the U.S. Title 51, Section 50905 requires that the FAA facilitate standards development, and that's the development of voluntary industry consensus standards. So we have been involved in the standards development in these areas, SSA, STM, and orbital debris mitigation from a commercial space transportation perspective. So let me go through a few of the things that I think are kind of relevant for the discussion today when we're talking about standards and STM and orbital debris. And these are some of the newer areas for commercial space transportation. Specifically, standards for areas like commercial crew, safety of the crew, spaceflight participants, cybersecurity for launch or reentry vehicles. These are all the areas that the FAA is extremely interested in the voluntary industry standards. And so we are continuing to work with our industry standard partners as well as Cont'd to look into those areas. And it was pointed out earlier that we have released Regulation 440, which is a very large regulation, 4 regulations combined into one and streamlined. But what it really does is it changes the way we look at our regulations from a purely prescriptive to performance-based regulation. And so standards, industry standards, are very important for that aspect because with more industry standards that are accepted, that we've reviewed, that just simplifies both the application, the review, and the timelines. And so when we go to more performance-based standards, we hope to have more industry standards that lead to better coordination and understanding. And so that's something we're looking at. We're also working on an orbital debris rule. This is not a surprise. The FAA has been working on this for a long time, not a decade, but very close to that. We've been looking at updating our regulations. We were a heavy participant in the update of the National Orbital Debris Mitigation Standard Practices. So like the FCC as a regulatory agency, we can't simply take the debris mitigation standard practices for the government and apply them to commercial operations. We have to go through rulemaking and receive public comment and look at the cost-benefit analysis for that specific industry. And space transportation, the launch and reentry aspects, has some unique aspects when it comes to orbital debris. And so we look forward to getting that out within the next year. We do have some existing rules. Upper stages previously were not safed, and then over time that they would fail, and they were the number one source of debris. So we've already addressed that in the safing of upper stages. Launch collision avoidance could be a source of debris. We've already implemented that. As a matter of fact, we moved that from the orbital debris rule forward into our streamlining regulations simply because of its importance. And we didn't wait for that one. We knew that the orbital debris mitigation standard practices were still being updated, but we grabbed everything on launch collision avoidance and moved it forward so that we could get that out a little bit sooner. But from our perspective, we really are looking for those industry standards in cybersecurity and crew and all of those areas to develop better regulations and to facilitate faster and more efficient operations with U.S. commercial space transportation. But I look forward to the questions, and I already see a number of questions in the side that are just building up. Back to you, George.
Thank you, Steph. Why don't we move now to NASA and ask J.C. Liou for some opening comments, please. J.C.?
Thank you, George. Next page, please. So this chart shows the development of history of the orbital debris mitigation policy, standards, requirements, and guidelines. The left column is the U.S. government. NASA is in the middle, and the international community and industry are in the right column. So starting from the upper left corner, orbital debris mitigation has been included in every national space policy since 1988. Specific mission requirements to limit the generation of new debris were first developed by NASA in 1995, which is shown as the first yellow box in the middle column. NASA then worked with the Department of Defense to establish the U.S. government orbital debris mitigation standard practices, ODMSP, that has been mentioned several times already in 2001, which is the first yellow box to the left. and the ODMSP was updated last year. Meanwhile, NASA, as a U.S. government representative to the Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee, the IADC, worked with the IADC to establish the IADC Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines in 2002, which is the first yellow box to the right. The IADC Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines then became the foundation of the United Nations Copious Space Debris Mitigation Guidelines in 2007 and the ISO standards in 2010. Obviously, the orbital debris mitigation standard practices, requirements, and guidelines evolve over time and will continue to be updated as necessary. Next page, please. So what more is needed in terms of the standards and best practices? The answer to this question will be driven by the challenges we face today and in the future. What are the key challenges? The orbital debris problem is twofold, long-term and short-term. The long-term problem is illustrated by this chart, the history of mass increase in orbit. Despite decades of efforts to limit the generation of new debris, the mass in orbit continued to go up. There is no sign of slowing down. And this really underlines the potential of a collision cascade effect, the Kessler syndrome. Good policies, guidelines, and best practices to limit the debris population increase have been put in place since 1995, as shown on the previous chart. The problem is the global space community is not doing a good job to follow the existing best practices. A good example is the 25-year rule. So if we exclude vehicles that will naturally decay in less than 25 years, which are dominated by small satellites, including CubeSats, the global compliance level with the 25-year rule is only about 30%. That is the reason behind the mass increase in low Earth orbit. The lack of compliance with existing standards and best practices is the problem. Next page, please. So for satellite operators, they are facing a different orbital debris problem, a short-term problem, which is a threat from orbital debris to their operational spacecraft. The orbital debris population follows a power law size distribution, meaning there's far more small debris than large debris. And as you can see from this notional size distribution of the debris population crossing low Earth orbit, there are about 10,000 debris larger than 10 centimeters, about 250,000 debris larger than 1 centimeter, and tens of millions of debris 1 millimeter and larger. When a 10 centimeter or larger debris impacts an operational spacecraft, the outcome is the catastrophic breakup of the vehicle, which is bad. When a 1 millimeter debris hits an operational spacecraft, the outcome may not be catastrophic, but the impact can penetrate the fuel tank, cause problems to batteries or other critical subsystems to terminate the mission early. And because there is far more small millimeter-sized orbital debris than 10 centimeters and larger debris, mission ending risk is driven by millimeter-sized orbital debris. Conjunction assessments and collision avoidance maneuvers against the large tracked objects only account for less than 1%. And let me repeat that, less than 1% of the mission-ending risk from orbital debris. Protecting spacecraft from mission-ending impacts by millimeter-sized orbital debris should be the #1 priority for the safe operation of future space missions. For space traffic management and space situational awareness, there is a critical need to establish standards and best practices on protecting missions from impacts by small orbital debris, such as shielding design and implementation of cost-effective impact shields. Because impact by small millimeter-sized orbital debris represent the highest mission-ending risk to operational spacecraft. Next, please. So what are the priorities? As stated in SPD 3, the goal of space traffic management is to enhance the safety, stability, and sustainability of operations in the space environment. For space traffic management, if safety is a priority, then orbital debris is a priority. If safety is a priority, then addressing risk from small orbital debris must be a priority to better protect space missions. There is a critical need to improve the space situational awareness on small millimeter-sized orbital debris and to establish new standards and best practices on protecting missions from small orbital debris impacts. For long-term environment management, the global space community must do a better job to comply with existing orbital debris mitigation policy, standards, and best practices to slow down the debris population increase. And at the same time, we all need to work together to establish long-term goals, combining mitigation and remediation to preserve the space environment for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, JC. Now let's see if we can get a perspective from the Department of Defense. Jeff Braxton. Over to you, Jeff.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
So, I really only have kind of one thing to foot stomp right now, and that is just came up a little recently. I won't give too much of the context in the interest of time, but it seems like there's still a persistent, and George, you, me, Steph, and others on the net have worked this at seemingly forever. But the concept that the Department of Defense is doing space traffic management as I speak. And that's really the furthest thing from the truth that I personally could imagine. So the things, not just space traffic management related as it's defined in SPD 3, but just the basic safety type things that underpin a full space traffic management regime, we're not doing that. That's not in existence right now. Really, what Department of Defense is doing is, sharing what we've got because we've got it. It's better than nothing, but we need to do way better than this. At the chance of being a little controversial, I would say, or running the risk of being a little controversial, I would say that we've talked about this probably way more than enough, and we really are at that inflection point, at least from a policy and legal perspective of we need to get moving out. We know what we need to do, and we need to get moving out on that. Whether it's, what Dr. Liou just talked about, Karl talked about, Kevin talked about, Steph talked about, we need to get moving out on some stuff. we're way past the point of being able to sit on our phones. From my perspective, as a security and defense guy, I want the domain to be stable. If stable means peaceful, then I want it to be peaceful. I want it to be safe. I want it to be sustainable, all those kinds of things. Because it has come over the past, we talked about the beginnings, Colonel Hernandez talked about the beginnings of the U.S. space enterprise and kind of the first high point, the first mountaintop experience, if you will, being Apollo 11 and then, followed on by the other missions. But we have to be able to operate in the environment. The environment has to be stable, secure, security. That's more my piece, and then sustainable overall. And so that's really underpinned by a couple of things, and I think they're interrelated. But we can treat them as if they are not for the purposes of today. But it comes down to operational practices. Operational, you can call them best, you can call them whatever. My son just got his driver's license. I looked at the operator's manual. It didn't say operational best practices for driving a car in the state of Nebraska. But it's kind of implied, right? And I think the other piece is we needed to get moving out a long time ago, better part of a decade, and that is to come up with some customary behavioral norms that responsible users of space can either agree on or share in a manner which it can inspire others to behave in the same way. And so that's kind of my perspective from a security and defense person here and now. That changes as we look out to the future, and in particular, what does security and defense look like when the presence in space is even much more civil and commercial aligned, and it routinely goes beyond the geobelt into the cislunar area, and perhaps even interplanetary beyond the moon on a more regular basis, even if that interplanetary piece is back and forth to asteroids, for instance. All of that needs to fall under this best operational practices, needs to fall under customary norms of behavior that are responsible in nature, and all that needs to have a security and defense element to it. A lot of my colleagues have been throwing around the ideas of how maritime got established in the blue water sense. And so, of course, we can look to that for some inspiration. I think there's some good exemplars there, but we need to get moving on that. And so really that's all I have to contribute. I don't want to talk for the sake of just talking. I look forward to the questions. I feel very much in good company. And so thank you for the honor and opportunity to be here with you all today.
Thanks, Jeff. Okay, why don't we move into some questions? Let me start off with some that we've gathered and encourage all the participants to type your questions into the chat box or raise your hand, and we'll try to get to as many as we can during the time we have today. Let me start off with one for Kevin. What advice would you give to industry as they continue to develop best standards and practices? Any thoughts you have, Kevin?
Well, so thanks, George, very much, and thanks for the question. I think the most important thing is to really work together as early as possible and to work with the government as early as possible in developing those standards. Jeff Braxton just threw in a contextual point that I don't think any of us have mentioned at this point. When we talk about the space economy, 80% of it is commercial at this point, and that percentage is bound to grow. And so the largest cluster of industry is here in the United States, and we see it every day here at Commerce, and the extent to which our industry, even our industry in concert with our allies, actually are able to come up with initial ideas, et cetera, and coordinate that with the government, that's wonderful. You all have heard me say before, I've always been a big fan of confers. I always say I wish I had 5 other organizations like confers, because as I see new market segments emerging, I'm hoping that industry is having similar conversations like they're having in confers about things like on-orbit refueling and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, other new mission areas. And so gather early. Industry has a lot of ideas in this area. It's also important because the technology is moving at such a speed at this point that the only way to stay relevant is to make sure that there's strong industry input to how we're thinking about these things. And that's a fairly uniquely American way of thinking about it.
Hey, thanks, Kevin. So, Karl, you talked a little bit about some of the recent things that FCC has come up with. Could you just review for us briefly some of the next steps you see and the expected timing for the rulemaking coming up from your area?
Yeah, so, we had a very robust record, a lot of participation, so that typically the steps which we will follow and are starting to do now is to work through the comments filed, the record, and identify key issues, and then develop recommendations that we work through the FCC, through the staff level, and eventually up to commissioners. On timing, I don't have any specific time frame to share with you. I think, as many of you know, the chairman will be, after 7 years, really an extraordinarily long period, will be moving on to other endeavors on January 20. We also have a change in one of our other long-standing commissioners. So there will be some changes at the leadership level at the FCC, and obviously that may influence timing of action and decision making. I would say, though, the one thing, as a staff person, from my perspective, and having worked in this area for many years, and worked on other issues at the FCC, you look for, issues where there is a strong correlation between party identity and policy views, just for awareness, for those of us who are at the staff level. I don't see that. I have not seen that on orbital debris issues and on these sort of issues of space safety. So we are working with at the leadership level with individuals who come to these issues with, I think, an open mind and an interest and consistent interest in doing the right thing for space safety and for the larger commercial space enterprise. So it will be, that makes things in some ways easier and in some ways harder. Sometimes the issues are not quite so clear cut, but we do then get a much sort of more diverse vetting as a result. So.
All right, thanks, Karl. Steph, you talked about the new Part 450 that the FAA has put out in terms of streamlined regulations and so forth. Talking about space traffic management standards, how do they differ for commercial space transportation as compared to spacecraft standards? Any thoughts there?
Thanks, George. Great question. So commercial space transportation is pretty much unique in this, and I noted a couple things. So when we saw the slide that JC put up, and there was a part where you saw the mass go down just a bit when the U.S. government started its debris mitigation standards. And I would hold that some of that, a lot of that, is because of the launch aspects of it. So you have the rocket equation, which basically says, 85% of your rocket is fuel. That leaves the rest, I would say, 1/4 of its payload and 3/4 of the remainder is rocket. So rockets and upper stages make up the bulk of the massive objects on orbit. Of the 50 objects that were supposed to be removed, or the most dangerous objects in orbit, I think 38 of them were payloads or something. Were rocket bodies. So when we talk about standards and we talk about commercial space transportation activities, there's just a difference. When you're talking about returning an upper stage, it's a very different prospect than returning your payload after 10 or 15 years, just because of the massiveness. So when we look at space traffic management and commercial space transportation, you're right. There's just a difference between the rules that we might be applying to commercial space transportation and rules that we would apply to satellites, primarily the same way you would see the rules for an 18-wheeler and the rules for your car are very different. But the purposes should be the same. I mean, the goal of safety is the same. How we implement that might be a little bit different between the two. And so that's kind of one of our primary concerns as we continue to develop these practices for space traffic management, is that we remember that we have two industries, a satellite industry and a commercial space transportation industry, that we're merging together to make sure that both are safe and that we receive the benefits of this without penalizing or basically grafting the wrong things on there. And I know we've looked at aviation, we've looked at maritime, we continually look at these other areas and kind of try to graft them in as we try to develop our best space policies here. But they're very different, and we're focused heavily on trying to make sure that we understand our industry and how it plays in this.
Great, thanks, Steph. JC, some organizations have suggested using active debris removal, or ADR, to fix the orbital debris problem. Do you think we need a policy or a standard on active debris removal?
George, thank you for the question. The SPT 3 states that the United States should pursue active debris removal as a necessary long-term approach to ensure the safety of space missions in key orbital regimes. However, the effort should not distract us from the current focus on orbital debris mitigation. So we already have a policy regarding the standards and best practices for active debris removal. The first principle of active debris removal is very simple: do no harm. But because of the complication of non-technical issues, such as legal, ownership, and cost, standards and best practices for active debris removal will be more difficult to develop. Also, from the environment management perspective, the priority is to limit the generation of new debris, which is a far more effective way to manage the orbital debris problem, at least for now. And we do have time to develop feasible and low-cost technologies for active debris removal, which will enable us for environment remediation in the future. Thank you.
Great, thanks, JC. So, Jeff, the trend appears to be that civil and commercial space are supporting security and defense entities, but from an academic perspective, how, if at all, do you see security and defense entities supporting civil and commercial space, say 50 years from now? And what are some key milestones along the way of getting there?
Well, yeah, I mean, right now, I think it gets back to when Kurt talked about that inflection point. Right now, from a security and defense perspective, we're able to, and we're ever increasingly harvesting the goodness of commercial SATCOM to do our mission, and not to backfill. I got to be really, really clear about that. It's become the backbone of a lot of what we do. And, you know, that goes on with commercial remote imagery, supporting our intelligence community, the intelligence communities of our closest allies and other partners. So that's kind of where we are now. But at some point, and again, this is kind of, if you push it out into the decades, 25 years, 50 years, as I kind of alluded to earlier, and Kevin also mentioned, you know, this preponderance of activity in space being civil and commercially aligned, we're going to have to pivot to make sure that we can secure and, as appropriate, hopefully on a not all too often basis, to defend it. Even if that capability to defend is what deters bad behavior against our civil and commercial endeavors in space. We've kind of started setting the backdrop for that with, you know, doing more in a combined arms, combined operations type sense with our allies and other partners. We're growing that a bit. You know, that's been another almost decades plus, or the better part of a decade we've been working on that. But that's what we have to account for. We can't just take the old, hey, everything that we need to be concerned about is from the geobelt on down, but we also, again, have to account for, hey, what does that look like when we're routinely going back and forth to gateway? I would say that gateway is not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. And, you know, that'll be, I think, driven by fiduciary concerns. We're going to have a lot of COVID bills to pay. So maybe, you know, that starts to move out to the right. I hope it doesn't get canceled outright, because I just don't think that's good moving forward. But again, and then when we get to the points of how are we going to do things like mineral extraction and those kinds of things, maybe from asteroids and other things, and all that to say is we might think that, oh, well, we won't do that. We would never do that. We don't advocate for doing that. But I guarantee you there's going to be others in the world who do. So we at least need to understand and account for it. And all of that, and I was remiss, I apologize to my ANSI colleagues on the line, I was remiss to say that standards, as a former test engineer, standards are just as important as operational practices, whether they're, whether you consider them best or whatever. I won't belabor that, but it's the idea of them being complementary and mutually supporting to one another. And then again, coupling those with how you behave properly, doing the right thing even when no one's looking because it's the right thing to do, and not being needed and not, needing to be told by international or domestic law, etc. I understand there's the compliance piece, and I'm not undermining at all. Actually, I am advocating for what Steph's group has been doing for so long and what Karl's group has been doing so long, and as that kind of changes moving forward. But that's the reality we need to be thinking about. Now, we can't just jump to there now. Some of the milestones, again, taking care of the easiest stuff first, or the most important stuff first, standards, operational best practices, establishing, even if it's only by custom, what is the responsible way to do things. And then continuing to evolve on my side, how do we secure and defend strategic lines of commerce in space, and as well as the civil lines that are, go alongside that.
Excellent, thanks. Why don't we pick up on the international aspects a little bit? Kevin, could you talk a little bit about whether there's any interest from other countries in standards or agreements or regulations or requirements related to space traffic management? And secondarily, if there were some accepted standards out there in the world right now, how would that change what commerce is doing and thinking about doing in the future?
So, George, thanks. That's a great question. First of all, there's, I would say, extraordinary international interest in what we've been doing. We have had conversations with a wide variety of our Commonwealth allies, European SST, the Japanese, and frankly other countries as well, I think there's a recognition that standards as they represent a pathway to rules of the road for space. Very, very strong interest in this. And so on the one hand, we're starting to have even more detailed conversations, I'll say bilateral, but it involves the government writ large in these conversations, where they're allies, about specific details, about sensors, about expertise that they have in everything from, space expertise to repositories to artificial intelligence to things like that. As everyone on the call knows, there's such a need to improve in so many different areas that everyone can contribute. And so that's actually a very good news story. Initially people had come to us and say, hey, Kevin, we don't have any space capabilities. The reality is this is as much an analytics and a visualization problem, developing warning models and new systems and things like that, that everyone can contribute. So the international enthusiasm is high. I don't think it would change our path at all, commerce, because it's something that we're on aggressively right now. NAPA reflected that in its review of our activities and others. It's necessary for us to move ahead, just as we have on the defense side for decades. It's just as necessary for us to move ahead and very cooperatively with our allies and like-minded partners as we tackle this tough challenge.
Excellent, thanks. So one for JC, we had a question come in about, given the current debris environment and its growth rate, at what level and when might we see the growth rate level off and achieve a steady state? You showed some curves on that a little bit earlier, but could you reiterate what your assessment is?
Yes, George, thank you for the question. So NASA, we conducted a major modeling study about 10 years ago, and the study was based on a very simple assumption. What if we stop launching anything into space from now on, now means 10 years ago? What will happen if we suspend the global space activity, no more launches? Will the orbital debris population start to decrease? And we completed the study and published the results in the journal Science. Unfortunately, the results show that even if we suspend global space launch activities, the orbital debris population will not decrease over time. Rather, accidental collisions among existing objects will eventually force the debris population in low Earth orbit to gradually increase over time. So it means we have crossed the threshold. We have crossed the threshold of instability already, at least in the low Earth orbit. But the good news is that the trend of the increase is slow. So in reality, the increase will be worse than the result of that study, because again, it was based on a new, no more new launches assumption. So the key is now how we have done other study to look into what if we have regular launches and we follow the existing orbital debris mitigation guidelines and best practices, especially the 25-year rule in low Earth orbit, what will happen? And the main takeaway point is that as long as we could follow, as long as the global community could follow a very high level of compliance with existing orbital debris mitigation standard and best practices, including the 25-year rule at a 90% level, 90% level, we will be able to control the debris population increase into a very slow linear increase over 100 or 200 years. So again, the simple question, simple answer to your question is that we will not be able to stabilize the debris population unless we consider active debris removal. But again, the increase is very slow, and we do have time to consider active debris removal, which is consistent with the policy position as stated in SPD 3. Thank you.
Thanks, JC. So, Steph, we had a question here. How is space traffic management addressed by space vehicles, systems capabilities, and availability? Should we start working on those regulations? Maybe you could talk a little bit about what you see the FAA role is and what current law dictates in terms of roles and responsibilities.
Well, I'll avoid the roles and responsibilities, but I will address the systems capabilities and availability question that they're raising here, which is an excellent question, because this is a mode of, if you would call it a mode of transportation, it's unlike any other. It's just not established the same way that other areas are. So in the Department of Transportation, we took bicycles off the highway a long time ago because they were unsafe. But what we don't have is that level of maturity in any type of space operation. So when we talk space traffic management and this person's question about, should we start, do we look at system capabilities and availability? That's a very hard question when you have new actors constantly coming in, new activities constantly starting. And so as we try to address what are the correct space traffic management policies and procedures and standards, you have to continually take these new actors and new activities into play. So that's a very hard question, and I'll be candid that we have not cracked that yet. And as far as space traffic management, we have not cracked that yet. And even in launch operations, I will say we understand we have a standard, but it's very difficult if you were trying to create a standard only with companies that have launched 10 or 20 or 100 times versus and then apply that standard to companies that have never launched. And so for us, it's a very difficult question, and I think this is going to take some time to figure out additionally. And I'll just point out that Jeff hit on an excellent point when he said, it's different at GEO than at LEO. So space traffic management needs to take that into account too. There are different safety issues at GEO than at LEO, or I should say risks. I guess the issues are the same. Don't get hit and don't impact other people, but your risks are different.
Excellent. Thanks, Steph. So, Karl, we had a question on, is there a plan in the FCC to standardize how launch risk is calculated? If I'm understanding the question, I think the launch risk issue is really one for the FAA, but do you have any comments on that? And then also, what would your opinion be on what's holding back the development and issuance of standards from the FCC right now? What are the pacing items in terms of why we're not there yet?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. I mean, if I understand what's meant by launch risk correctly, that is a question for the FAA. And just to be clear on the kind of the broad dividing line, the FAA licenses the launch, and Steph will correct me if I get this wrong, but licenses the launch vehicle activities and the leading up to the delivery of payloads into orbit. The FCC addresses radio frequency operations for all non-federal launch vehicles and payloads, but with respect to orbital debris mitigation, we focus, because of the FAA's role, just on payloads and the payloads that we license for longer-term on-orbit operations. So, and I would say, depending on what's meant by launch risk, depends, I guess, how long your view is of what flows from a launch. Obviously, our efforts with respect to the addition of numerical criteria for the activities we license, the payload activities, really is intended to provide some standards or to align our regulations with what's followed in the U.S. government more generally.
Great. Thank you very much. So we're coming to the end of our time now, but I'd like to ask each of the panelists for just any closing comments they would offer, and in particular, what is your sense of the urgency and importance of this issue? Is this something we need to keep on analyzing and talking about some more, or as Jeff was mentioning, is the time for action really now? So let me start with you, Kevin, and see if you can summarize some of the key points for takeaway.
Sure, George, thank you. I'm very much already on record as saying this is an urgent problem that gets more complex by the day. I don't think anybody on this call is surprised by that. We absolutely need to take action. At Commerce, we're actually making a push right now for the resources that we need to take on the SPD-3 mission as endorsed by NAPA. We do need to move ahead quickly because not only is there a need, a demand, if you will, for it, but we're also seeing alternative views of how to do this. We do favor, and this is very pertinent in a standards-based discussion, we do favor a bottoms-up discussion based on the speed of the technology, based on the dynamism in the industry. Steph is right to say it's hard to apply a standard when something different and new is coming along every single day. That is the nature of the space economy going forward. And so we are really adverse to, bottoms or top-down legalistic approaches to try to mandate a solution that we'll have to debate internationally for the next decade and will be irrelevant today, the day if we ever get agreement on it. And so we do have to take action. We have to take action now. It's a whole of government effort, and it always will be. So I guess I'd just stop right there.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. Karl, any closing thoughts?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I would echo that there is urgency, and it kind of strikes home very much for us at the FCC. We have, a significant number of companies who are interested in developing large constellations, small constellations, have new concepts for operations, and so on. And so, those are cases that come up and need to be addressed, in a reasonable time period, essentially all the time. And so the addition of a larger perspective that provides a way to address those individual cases is certainly something that's extremely important, and certainly welcome all the work that's going into that and that will in the future.
Excellent. Thanks, Karl. Steph, any closing comments?
I guess the only thing I would add on this, and I agree with Karl and Kevin, and the time to start moving is now. You're right. We do need to start getting greater action, greater coordination. I would also like to think that we want to be a little bit out of the box on some of the stuff that we're doing, because we do have a lot of issues. And I guess I will just end with, for us, when I saw the question about launch risk, that brings me right to the question of who are we working for? And for us, public safety it's about the public being our customer. And when we start talking about space traffic management, is it time? Who is the customer in that? Is it the person you're regulating, or is it you're doing this for everyone else? And that's the public question. I think that's a great way of looking at the need for these types of activities, and just kind of a reminder that we're not simply regulating them because we want to regulate. That's not why we do this. We're doing this so that we enable our economy, our safety, our future. And I think that's something we just have to keep remembering.
Great thoughts. Thanks, Steph. JC, any closing comments?
Thank you, George. Time for action is to really better comply with existing orbital debris mitigation standards and best practices. There's, of course, always room for improvement to improve existing policy guidelines, standards, and best practices. But the key is to comply with what we already have. That's really the priority number one. And at the same time, we will need to address the risk from small orbital debris for the safe operations of future space missions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. And final comments, Jeff.
So I would just say I agree 100% that we don't, it's kind of spanning across everyone else who just provide closing comments, that we don't need to do this top down as much as we need to do it. And, the danger of the top down approach is that it'll stymie innovation in an environment or in an area of our lives, which is moving super fast. And so we have to balance the two, the need to be authoritative and regulatory and those kinds of things too, but we also need to have some flexibility baked in. And I think that's going to be a key moving forward, is striking that balance. And I would also say that this isn't just about large constellations or small constellations. I think it's about everybody who's going to do anything in the domain. Manned, unmanned, single satellite, 6 million satellites, whatever. And again, it's not just about from GEO on down. Thank you, Steph, for providing me a compliment there. But it's about everything. We got to be thinking about the future, not just what we're struggling with right now. And I think we need to get on this 10 years ago, if that makes any sense. And in a less serious note, I would say they said it in Monty Python's Holy Grail quite profoundly, and that is, get on with it. We need to get on with it. We need to be moving out, and we will iterate to success, as we quite often do in many other areas of our lives. So that's it.
Excellent. Well, that brings us to the end of our time today. Thanks again to the panelists and for all the participants for the excellent questions. And I'll turn it back over to Jim McCabe. Jim.
Thank you very much, George, and thanks to all of our speakers and our Government Perspectives panel. Very enlightening. We are now on a break until 1:30 Eastern. We will leave the meeting open and the lines open, but please rejoin us at 1:30 p.m. for the industry panel. Thank you.